a.m., Japan launched a surprise attack on the United States of America by bombing the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. The base was attacked by 350 Imperial Japanese aircrafts. Though the raid only lasted 75 minutes, the Japanese destroyed or damaged nearly 20 American naval vessels, including 8 battleships and more than 340 airplanes. Over 2,400 Americans died in the attack, and many more were wounded. While the attack on Pearl Harbor was a surprise, tensions between the US and Japan had deteriorated over the decade, in particular with regards to Japan's expansion into China. The plan for attacking Pearl Harbor was to destroy the US's Pacific Fleet, a move which would give the Japanese time to carry out its plans to keep control of the Pacific without US interference. The shock of the attack without declaration of war enraged the American public and rallied the nation to get behind a war many hoped to avoid. At the beginning of his speech to Congress requesting a declaration of war, President Franklin D. Roosevelt delivered this now famous line.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan.
On December 8, 1941, one day after the attack, the United States Congress declared war on Japan, officially entering.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. The Congress declare that since the unprovoked and dastardly attack by Japan, a state of war has existed between the United States and the Japanese Empire.
Pearl Harbor came as a complete shock to some, but an inevitable reality for others, with this surprise attack marking the United States' entry into the deadliest war in human history, in which over 50 million people would perish across the globe. But why did the Japanese attack Pearl Harbor? What were their motivations, and how did they manage to catch the Americans so off guard, with their attack on Pearl Harbor becoming the deadliest attack on US territory until the events of 9/11? For the United States, a series of decisions made by both Roosevelt himself and others in the State Department were instrumental in bringing about Japan's attack, with often well-intentioned policies aimed at stopping the spread of the Japanese Empire in Asia, ultimately bringing war upon their own soldiers stationed overseas. To understand the real reason Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, the video will be split into 4 distinct chapters, each highlighting the key reasons as to why it occurred. The first chapter will highlight Japan's rapid transformation from an isolated country at the time of the samurai into a modern industrial power, one that became so powerful in such a short time that it could even rival the great colonial nations of the West. Having modernized the nation during the Meiji Restoration, Chapter 2 will discuss what they did with this newfound wealth and power, taking you step by step through Japan's wars of conquest in East Asia, which, ultimately, put them on the road to war with the United States. This chapter will also explore the challenges Japan faced during the early 20th century as it tackled a growing empire and suffered under the economic turmoil of the Great Depression, including the detailed plans of Isoroku Yamamoto, the mastermind behind the attack, and why he chose this base on the island chain of Hawaii in the middle of the Pacific as the primary target for his attack, Harbor, and how the United States was drawn into the most deadly conflict in human history. Japan, With a diplomatic solution now to be pursued, the task would be up to Japan's new Prime Minister, Fumimaro Konoye, who had taken power in July 1940. Born into one of Japan's most influential aristocratic families and a close personal friend of Emperor Hirohito, Konoye found support across all aspects of Japanese society, being described as a man of such wide interests and objectivity that he could listen with sympathy to those of all political beliefs. In fact, he listened with such sympathy that each in turn thought the prince agreed with him. However, Konoye's willingness to accept a wide range of political views would not only be his greatest strength, but also his greatest flaw, with his ability to hold seemingly opposite viewpoints on the same topic, making his own political beliefs difficult to discern, and something others would look to take advantage of. Konoye was a supporter of Japan's imperial conquests, sharing the view with the military that Japan should be, unquestionably, the major uncontested power of East Asia. He would also have a growing interest in the ideological tenets of fascism, particularly its emphasis on national unity and strong leadership, with him often willing to concede to the ideas of strong-willed militarists. Where he differed from the military, however, was that he believed war with the United States would almost certainly prevent them from achieving the empire they all looked to create. If war was to break out, Konoye believed that there was little chance of overcoming America's industrial potential. Not only this, but Konoye was also a student of the prominent reformer Saionji Kinmochi, the last surviving statesman of the Meiji generation. Saionji warned that it was essential to cooperate with Britain and America if Japan was to thrive, with Konoye following in his mentor's footsteps by prioritizing a diplomatic solution to the oil embargo crisis with the West. As such, despite his many contradictions, Konoye was viewed by most, including the Emperor himself, as the best chance Japan had at avoiding war. If he was to succeed, however, Konoye would have to overcome a significant obstacle: the military's uncontested power. The very structure of the Japanese government had ensured that none could oppose them, which would make his negotiations with the United States nearly impossible. At the head of the government was the Emperor, a divine figure whose seal was needed in order to officiate policy. To the Japanese, the Emperor was a living god, the father to the nation, to whom they would all pledge to serve to the death. None in the country, except for the most high-ranking generals and government officials, had ever heard his voice, with children taught that they would go blind if they were ever to look directly at his face. Emperor Hirohito, just like Konoye, was a student of the liberal reformer Prince Saionji Kinmochi, and as such was generally against the idea of a full-scale war with the United States. Having travelled to the West himself, Hirohito feared that Japan would be unable to win against the industrial power of America, and would therefore attempt to guide his government away from the path of conflict. However, despite his wishes to avoid war, Hirohito's ability to do so would be extremely limited, with tradition dictating that he was unable to oppose a policy once it had been decided upon by members of the government and military. Acting simply as a figurehead, he would be presented with these policies at imperial conferences, where he was expected to remain silent and rubber stamp whatever was put before him. Not only this, but Japan would operate under a unique dual government system that divided power between civilian and military authorities, both of which were answerable only to the Emperor himself. Crucially, as the military had an entirely separate chain of command, it meant that neither the Prime Minister nor any in the civilian government had any direct control over them, allowing the military to use their direct access to the Emperor in order to force through advantageous policies without any interference. Not only this, but the Supreme Command would have the power to veto any cabinet decision that they believed infringed upon military affairs, leaving the government virtually powerless to oppose them. With this power, they would be able to pursue their ultimate goal of a Japanese empire that dominated Asia and the Pacific. Konoye, as head of the civilian government, would therefore have the difficult task of not only reaching a diplomatic compromise with the United States, but also keeping the military happy so they did not interfere with negotiations. In an attempt to keep the military in check, Konoye would appoint a new war minister, Hideki Tojo, a general in the Imperial Army who was well known and respected amongst the military ranks for achieving a number of impressive victories within China. A man of extreme conviction, Tojo was known to never waver on his ideals, with him demanding absolute discipline from his subordinates. As such, although he believed fully in Japan's divine right of conquest, he had no tolerance for the rebellious young officers who he saw as disgracing the nation. By appointing Tojo, Konoye hoped he would be able to keep these rogue members of the army in check, and finally help bring about some much-needed discipline and order that would be crucial if negotiations were to go well with the United States. To begin negotiations, Konoye would first seek the military's permission to open diplomatic channels with the West. Despite harboring doubts that they would lead to anything of substance, the military would ultimately agree, although they would put a hard deadline on negotiations, October 10th, 1941, just 2 months away. If he had not reached a settlement by this date, they would resort to armed conflict. With time now of the essence, Conyers believed that a personal meeting with Roosevelt was the only way he could resolve the two countries' many differences and come to an agreement before the army's deadline. If the president still does not see reason, I shall, of course, be fully prepared to break off the talks and return home, Conyers told Tojo and Navy Minister Okawa. He believed negotiations were the best path forward, and that both nations would have to make concessions if war was to be averted. And so, Conyers would send a message on August 7th to Secretary of State Cordell Hull, requesting that he be given an audience with Roosevelt to discuss resolving the differences between both countries. Hull, however, took a hardline approach towards the Japanese and believed that any sign of weakness on America's part would only encourage their plans for territorial expansion. A long-time advocate for free trade and international cooperation, Hull believed that the promotion of these ideas would promote economic interdependence and discourage nations from resorting to conflict. However, the rise of aggressive regimes in Germany, Italy, and Japan posed a significant challenge to Hull's vision of a peaceful and interconnected world, with him being increasingly distrustful of the Japanese, who he saw as negotiating in bad faith, with their only goal to delay Western interference in their conquests.
The specter of a new descent into the conditions of international anarchy which characterized the Dark Ages looms on the horizon today. Our own nation, powerful as it is, and determined as it is to remain at peace, to preserve its cherished institutions, and to promote the welfare of its citizens, is not secure against that menace.
With both Roosevelt and Hull coming to see a conflict with Japan ever more likely, the president came to hold two opposing but pragmatic viewpoints: the want to settle negotiations diplomatically, but also bide time to strengthen their Pacific fleet if negotiations fell through. As Roosevelt would state to British Prime Minister Winston Churchill in 1941, "If negotiations with Japan failed, at the very least, I think I can baby them along for 3 months." It was a risky policy, but if diplomacy failed, it would hopefully buy them just enough time to prepare for a conflict if one was to occur. With these objectives in mind, Hull, upon receiving Conyers' proposal, was extremely cautious, believing that much like Hitler had done to Chamberlain in Munich, it was simply a ruse, a bid to buy time, and they had no intention of keeping their word. As such, Hull responded that it remained with the Japanese government to decide whether it could find means of shaping its policies accordingly, and then endeavour to evolve some satisfactory plan. Hull was essentially dismissing Conyers' proposal outright, and was effectively stating that no official meeting could take place until Japan agreed to significant concessions. For the military, agreeing to contact the Americans at all was a significant concession, with Hull's dismissal causing growing suspicion amongst Japanese leaders. It appeared to them that rather than a genuine desire for peace, the Americans themselves were stalling for time. Time they could ill afford to lose, as each day 12,000 tons of irreplaceable oil was being consumed. Although Hull's response had stalled negotiations, Roosevelt himself was open to the idea of meeting with Conyers, and stated that the United States would be prepared to reopen the unofficial preparatory discussions which were broken off in July, and every effort will then be made to select a time and place to exchange views. However, the date he suggested would be the middle of October, which, unknowingly, would be the exact deadline the military had given Conyers. Back in Japan, many were beginning to have serious reservations over a full-scale war with America. Colonel Hideo Iwakura would meet with several military and political figures, urging that negotiations must succeed as America's industrial potential would result in a crushing Japanese defeat if a military conflict was to occur. He contrasted the alarming differences between American and Japanese war potential. In steel, he said the ratio was 20 to 1, oil more than 100 to 1, coal 10 to 1, planes 5 to 1, shipping 2 to 1, labor force 5 to 1. The overall potential was 10 to 1. At such odds, Japan could not possibly win, despite Yamato Damashi, the spirit of Japan. Although not all would heed his words, many had become sympathetic to Iwakuro's arguments, with the Supreme Command capitulating and agreeing to allow major concessions if it meant war was to be averted. And so, on August 28th, 2 messages were sent to Roosevelt. The first would be from Conyers, yet again requesting a meeting between himself and the president, with the second message officially declaring that they would withdraw all Japanese troops from French Indochina once the war with China had been resolved, promising to make no further military advances into neighbouring countries, and that they would respect the Soviet Union's borders as long as they did not attack Japanese assets in Manchukuo. Not only this, but they would also agree to abide by 4 basic principles outlined by Hull as essential if any negotiations were to take place. Number 1. Respect for the territorial integrity and the sovereignty of each and all nations. Number 2. Support of the principle of non-interference in the internal affairs of other countries. Number 3. Support of the principle of equality, including equality of commercial opportunity. Number 4. Non-disturbance of the status quo in the Pacific, except as the status quo may be altered by peaceful means. This was a drastic concession for the Japanese to make. Not only were they willing to negotiate on America's terms, but by agreeing to the point, the military would have to halt their plans for the expansion of the Japanese Empire. Upon receiving the Japanese response, Roosevelt was initially enthusiastic. At long last, the two countries were beginning to come to a compromise, with the president drawing up plans to spend 3 much-needed days with Konie. However, not everyone was impressed. American codebreakers had managed to crack the Japanese diplomatic code, an operation they called Magic. This breakthrough granted US officials, including Secretary of State Hull, unprecedented access to the confidential communications of high-ranking Japanese officials, often knowing of their intentions, strategies, and negotiating positions before official meetings even took place. As such, Hull and others were usually dismissive of any direct correspondence or outreaches by the Japanese government, often coming to conclusions based on these magic reports alone. Accompanying the latest Japanese proposals were new magic intercepts, indicating that a significant new military build-up was taking place in Southeast Asia. For Hull, this was a clear sign of Japanese deception. How could Konie's outreach be genuine, with the promise to withdraw troops from Indochina if their military was preparing for war? Sharing his concerns with Roosevelt, the president's earlier optimism completely vanished, with him and Hull deciding that a meeting with the Japanese would now be impossible, unless an even more explicit guarantee was given that the American demands would be met. However, America's ambassador in Tokyo, Joseph C. Grew, had come to a completely different opinion. Grew was considered a legend in the State Department, having served as a diplomat for nearly 40 years and in 14 different posts, with St. Petersburg and Berlin being amongst them. Having great affection for Japan, as well as his wife both speaking Japanese and being a descendant of Matthew Perry, the US Commodore who had commanded the Black Ships nearly a century ago, Grew was considered the best choice for ambassador to Japan when conflict broke out in Manchuria in 1931. Having been stationed there for now nearly a decade, Grew had come to develop a deep understanding of both the complexities of the Japanese system, as well as the thoughts and desires of those in key leadership positions.
The Japanese are not easy to know. I've lived among them for 10 years. You cannot measure Japanese sense of logic by any Western yardstick.
With the Americans having yet again dismissed Japan's attempts to have a face-to-face meeting, army leaders began to grow increasingly agitated, with even the emperor himself now urging for a diplomatic solution to be the nation's top priority. As a result, Konie would meet with Grew in person and attempt to resolve their differences. What about Hull's 4 principles? Grew would ask the Prime Minister. They were generally acceptable, Konie replied. However, when it comes to applying them practically, various problems will arise, and to solve them, I must have a meeting with the President. Although Konie was unable to reveal it to Grew, the deadline the military had set him to complete negotiations was only a month away, and he understood that at this point, using regular diplomatic channels would simply be far too slow, and so urged again that a face-to-face meeting was vital if they were to settle their differences. A year from now, I am not sure that anything can be done to solve our differences, Konie stated, but I can do now. I promise that some agreement can be reached if I can only see him. I'll offer him a proposal which he can't afford to reject. Grew believed Konie's plea to meet with the President was sincere, and the fact that the Prime Minister had agreed to abide by Hull's 4 principles gave Grew the sense that Konie was genuine in his attempts to bring hostilities to an end via diplomatic means. As a result, Grew told Konie that he would go back to the embassy immediately and send his message to Washington, something he touted as the most important cable of his diplomatic career. The ambassador stresses the importance of understanding Japanese psychology, fundamentally unlike that of any Western nation. Japanese reactions to any particular set of circumstances cannot be measured, nor can Japanese actions be predicted by any Western measuring rod. Should the United States expect or await agreement by the Japanese government in the present preliminary conversations to clear-cut commitments which will satisfy the United States government, both as to principle and as to concrete detail. Almost certainly, the conversations will drag along indefinitely and unproductively, until the Kanye cabinet and its supporting elements, desiring rapprochement with the United States, will come to the conclusion that the outlook for an agreement is hopeless, and that the United States government is only playing for time. This will result in the Kanye's government being discredited, and in a revulsion of anti-American feeling, and this may, and probably, will lead to unbridled acts. Despite Gru's message, however, Hull and the American leadership had already largely made up their minds, dismissing his cable as the concerns of an ambassador who had grown too close to Japan. Therefore, rather than following Gru's advice, Hull would respond to Kanye, and rather than clarifying or softening his terms, would instead ask for a concession that was almost certain to guarantee war. All Japanese troops, he demanded, must be completely withdrawn from China without delay if a meeting between Kanye and Roosevelt was to be arranged. Having received the response, Kanye would gather the top officials from across the nation to discuss the issue at his villa in Okikubo. But the army, to little surprise, were infuriated by Hull's demands. For them, the American position was now clear. To demand such concessions without a meeting even taking place meant only one thing. It appeared as though they were only trying to buy time, with every sincere Japanese outreach to meet a settlement either being met with mockery or complete dismissal. Attempting to move negotiations forward, Foreign Minister Teijiro Toyoda would speak first. "I think the thorniest issue today is the presence of troops in China, and if the army won't concede a thing to the United States, then there's no point in continuing the talks. But if the army can see its way clear to making some slight compromise, it may not be impossible." Furious, War Minister Tojo would respond immediately. "The stationing of troops is a matter of life and death to the army. No concessions in that direction." Japan had already agreed, in principle, to the withdrawal of all troops from China, he continued. That in itself was a tremendous concession. Now it was obvious that America was demanding that Japan withdraw all troops at once. This was impossible. 1 million Japanese were still locked in battle in China. Japan could not withdraw completely until order was restored in China. The interior was a hotbed of communists and bandits, and only the presence of Japanese troops in certain areas could guarantee law and order and the successful economic growth of that whole part of the continent. Total withdrawal before the aims of war had been accomplished would not be in keeping with the dignity of the army, and the entire general staff, as well as the troops abroad, agreed with him. "Why not give in to America in form?" Kanye replied. "That is, agree in principle to withdraw all troops, yet make an arrangement with China to retain some troops in unstable areas." "That would not be tenable," said Tojo. "If they made the pledge to withdraw all troops from the region, they would have to honor their word. And not only this, but if they gave in to American demands, China would see Japan as weak, and soon uprisings could spring up not only in China, but Korea as well." Despite being the only man present arguing for war, Tojo refused to back down. "I don't think there is any possible way to settle the problem by diplomacy at this stage," he would state. Kanye, however, held the complete opposite opinion, believing that war with the US was futile, and that a meeting with Roosevelt was still Japan's best option. "I'm not confident of victory in war," he stated. "I think there is no way to overcome the present difficulties except by diplomatic negotiations." Tojo's forceful remarks would continue throughout the afternoon, until finally the men assembled would reach a decision. Kanye would have until October 15th, a 5-day extension, to finish negotiations with the United States, but the army, under no circumstances, would concede anything on the removal of their troops from China. However, while Kanye had initially approved of the compromise, he would come to regret it almost immediately. The removal of troops from China appeared to be the only thing the Americans were interested in, and without this vital bargaining chip, he was unlikely to be able to come to any sort of agreement with Roosevelt. Phoning Tojo on October 14th, one day before the deadline was due, he would plead with the War Minister to reconsider. "I can go along with you, except for your stand on our troops in China," he would state. But Tojo's reply was swift and uncompromising. "If once we give in, the United States will assume a high-handed attitude and keep on acting that way. Your solution is really not a solution. War will crop up again in a few years. I respect you, Mr. Prime Minister, but your view is too pessimistic. You know our weak points too well. America has her weaknesses too." That same day, the cabinet assembled yet again to discuss the issue of China. "The army will continue its preparations," said Tojo. "I don't mean this will necessarily interfere with the negotiations, but I will not consider another day's delay. However, Foreign Minister Toyoda would state that it was paramount that they give the US a clear and straightforward response. America is becoming more and more suspicious of our attitude, so we can't satisfy them unless we give them facts. They cannot understand Japan's way of carrying on peace talks while preparing for war. Tojo, however, refused to give any ground, this time shouting, "I make no concessions regarding withdrawal. It means defeat of Japan by the United States, a stain on the history of the Japanese Empire. The way of diplomacy isn't always a matter of concession, sometimes it is oppression. If we concede, Manchuria and Korea will be lost." Tojo's outburst had stunned the cabinet into silence, shocked that the war minister had expressed such a forceful opinion. It left Connier with very few options. The war minister's refusal to concede on the matter of China meant that negotiations with the US were now impossible. Continuing as Prime Minister would force Connier down the path of war, and as such, he saw no option but to resign. Connier's decision was a deadly blow for those in Japan who still wanted peace. Even generals in the army were alarmed at the prince's resignation. General Muto, although believing Connier to be a coward, thought he was the only man capable of maintaining national unity, with his absence guaranteeing division and infighting. If he resigns, the general stated, Japan cannot fight a war. However, to the dismay of many in the government, Connier's resignation would come sooner than expected. On October 16th, he would inform Koichi Kido, the emperor's chief advisor, of his resignation, with the choice of his successor now on everybody's mind. Both the new prime minister and the cabinet would be the most consequential and important one to date, with a responsibility to assemble a government capable of bringing about peace, now falling on Kido's shoulders. Known as a calculating and pragmatic man, Kido, just like the emperor, supported diplomacy and international cooperation, believing that a war with the West would spell disaster for Japan. With tradition dictating that the emperor was unable to become directly involved in politics, Kido would act as his representative, expressing Hirohito's wishes during imperial conferences and helping to guide the government from behind the scenes. Wishing to avoid war, but also recognizing the need to keep the military under control, Kido was left with few options when appointing the new prime minister. To handle this delicate situation, Kido believed it would have to be somebody already familiar with the negotiations, and also someone respected enough for both the government and army to follow their wishes. This left Kido with, which read the following. Negotiations with the Japanese appear to be terminated to all practical purposes, with only the barest possibilities that the Japanese government might come back and offer to continue. Japanese future action unpredictable, but hostile action possible at any moment. If hostilities cannot be avoided, the United States desires that Japan commit the first overt act. This policy should not be construed as restricting you to a course of action that might jeopardize your defense. The road to war had been set, and a conflict in the Pacific was soon to come to fruition. Receiving Hull's 10-point demand the next day on November 27th, the response would be read aloud by Prime Minister Tojo in a meeting of Japan's top government and military officials. As Tojo finished reading the note, the room fell silent in disbelief. "This is an ultimatum," one man would shout, with another, Admiral Shimeda, declaring Hull's note to be a jarring blow, as well as unyielding and unbending in its failure to acknowledge any of the concessions that had taken such great effort to achieve. The most egregious point would be Hull's demand for an immediate withdrawal from China. Although Hull had intended this point not to include Manchuria, the wording of his response left this incredibly ambiguous, with the Japanese, assuming he was demanding they abandon the territory they had won all the way back in 1932. The loss of Manchuria would spell economic disaster for Japan, considering the amount of time and resources they had poured into the region, let alone the blood they had spilt to claim it. From the Japanese perspective, Hull's note was clearly designed to be impossible to accept, yet another stalling tactic to entice Japan into striking the first blow. America had made up her mind and was ready to go to war. The negotiations they had earnestly thought would bring about peace had been in vain. From the Japanese perspective, America had simply been stalling for time. On December 1st, 1941, with the deadline having finally been reached, Emperor Hirohito would comply with the wishes of his military and government, and conceded to declaring war on the United States. Following in Japan's historic tradition of surprise attacks, a plan, months in the making, would now be put underway to begin the war by striking at the American naval base at Pearl Harbor. With Japan now on the path to war, their hopes of success would lie on the shoulders of Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, a highly gifted naval officer and commander-in-chief of the Japanese combined fleet. However, when Yamamoto had assumed his position as head of the Japanese naval forces, he had found the existing plan for war against the United States to be completely inadequate. Japan's admirals had been expecting the Americans to launch an all-out attack on their fleet close to the home islands, with a decisive battle then culminating in Japanese waters, where their navy reigned supreme. Much like the decisive battles of the past, such as when the legendary Admiral Togo had wiped out the Russian fleet at the Battle of Tsushima, it would be this coming battle, just off the coast of Japan, that would bring about the victory they had hoped for. However, this strategy Yamamoto believed was reactive and relied too heavily on the United States to make the first move. Instead, upon taking command of the Japanese combined fleet, he would look for a different strategy, drawing upon his knowledge of modern naval warfare. Having spent many years in America, studying at Harvard University and acting as a naval diplomat in Washington, Yamamoto was well aware of the vast industrial potential the United States possessed, which would undoubtedly overwhelm Japan if a prolonged conflict was to break out. As such, he was an open critic of war with the United States, a stance that put him in danger of assassination by fanatical army ultranationalists, with him warning Prime Minister Connolly in 1941. In the first 6 to 12 months of a war with the United States and Great Britain, I will run wild and win victory upon victory. But then, if the war continues after that, I have no expectation of success. When war seemed all but inevitable, however, Yamamoto would reluctantly take on responsibility for planning the attack. A natural risk-taker, he was known as an expert gambler, being proficient in games of luck and strategy, such as poker, bridge, shogi, and go. As such, he was willing to risk everything in one daring attack that was aimed at wiping out the American fleet before the conflict even began. Taking inspiration from his hero, the legendary Admiral Togo, whom Yamamoto had served under 35 years ago during the Russo-Japanese War, he would now look to launch a surprise attack of his own, just like Togo had done all those years ago that had successfully crippled the Russian fleet. This time, however, it would not be the Russians that were his target, but the American naval base at Pearl Harbor. Yamamoto also believed that it was vital to destroy America's aircraft carriers in the attack, as he saw them as being the true heart of a modern navy, as opposed to battleships, as many of his contemporaries still believed. Removing America's aircraft carriers now would give Japan the best chance it had to secure domination over the Pacific. Along with the importance of taking out the American carriers, attacking Pearl Harbor would also open up the way for Japanese conquests to the south. With negotiations with the US having failed, they were now desperate to acquire a new source of oil, with the Dutch East Indies and their plentiful oil fields now ripe for the taking. However, the flow of these resources back to Japan could still be disrupted by American forces in the Philippines, with the neutralization of this American outpost a necessity if their plan was to be successful. The Philippines, however, would prove difficult to take. Not only was it an important American base under the command of renowned General Douglas MacArthur, but if war was to break out, it could be supplied and reinforced with troops and ships from Pearl Harbor. Taking out Pearl Harbor, therefore, would be a top priority, as it would leave the Philippines isolated and exposed for the taking. The attack Yamamoto hoped would therefore give Japan time, around 6 months, to seize the Dutch East Indies and secure control of Southeast Asia and the Western Pacific without American interference. During this time, Japan could also begin construction of new battleships and aircraft carriers, increasing its presence and naval might in the region. With the Pacific securely under Japanese control and the American fleet having been completely wiped out, they would now be able to establish a defensive perimeter, something they referred to as the Absolute National Defense Zone, a vertical line that stretched from western New Guinea to the Kuril Islands north of mainland Japan. The territory within this zone would be referred to as the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, and would ensure that the Japanese could transport the vital resources of oil, tin and rubber from their conquests back to the homeland without interference from the Western powers. If all went according to plan, and with their power now uncontested across the region, Yamamoto believed that the United States would be forced to accept Japanese dominance in East Asia, with a prolonged conflict between the two nations becoming an unthinkable idea. Japan was to be so strong and well positioned that the Americans would be foolish even to consider war. Pearl Harbor itself was stationed in Hawaii, an American territory in the Pacific that was a vital part of US defense in the region, due to its central location and proximity to Asia, acting as a potential buffer against Japanese expansionism. Its deep water harbour, extensive repair facilities, and ample supplies made it an ideal location for the American Navy to station its fleet, with the base also serving as a vital hub for communications and intelligence gathering. As such, the base at Pearl Harbor was home to a majority of the US Pacific Fleet, including 3 carriers, 8 battleships, 8 cruisers, and 30 destroyers, with it acting as a forward operating base for projecting American power into the region. Pearl Harbor itself was stationed on the central island of Oahu, located just west of the capital city of Honolulu. Although home to around 40,000 military personnel, peacetime liberties had been granted, with the men stationed there making use of the many luxuries the tropical island provided. This relaxed atmosphere, however, would be something the Japanese looked to exploit, with Admiral Yamamoto sending a spy, Takeo Yoshikawa, on a reconnaissance mission, to infiltrate the island and gather as much vital information as possible. Disguising himself as a tourist, wearing sunglasses and a bright Hawaiian shirt, Yoshikawa would drive around the island twice a week and visit Pearl Harbor every day, memorizing the length of the main runways, as well as the numbers of planes, pilots, hangars, and soldiers, delivering all of this information back to Tokyo. The security on the island was so lax, in fact, that Yoshikawa was able to infiltrate the American naval base several times, even managing to scuba dive underneath the harbor to check the integrity of the torpedo nets that protected the ship stationed there. Once armed with a lunchbox, he followed a group of laborers and spent the day wandering around without being questioned. He tapped a big oil tank to see how much was inside and discovered that full tanks usually leaked and could easily be detected from outside the fence. With the essential information Yoshikawa provided now in Yamamoto's hands, he was able to finalize his plans for the attack. By April, Yamamoto's plan to attack Pearl Harbor would be officially named Operation Z, a name he had chosen in honor of a famous message, known as the Z signal, that Admiral Togo had conveyed to his men before the Battle of Tsushima. On this one battle rests the fate of our nation. Let every man do his utmost. The upcoming attack on Pearl Harbor, Yamamoto believed, would be of equal significance. The fate of Japan hung in the balance. For the attack itself, Yamamoto planned to use aircraft carriers to strike the American base. At a time when most Japanese admirals still favored traditional naval engagements, using battleships and other surface vessels in head-to-head combat, Yamamoto was one of the first to recognize the strength of modern naval aviation, the use of planes at sea, funding and promoting the construction of a fleet of 10 aircraft carriers by 1941, each of which could launch over 50 aircraft. The employment of these carriers would make the entire operation possible, allowing the Japanese to launch a devastating air raid against Pearl Harbor, all while keeping their own ships at a distance, safe from retaliation. As such, a strike force of 6 carriers would be created to carry out the mission, known as the Kido Butai, with Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo to serve as its commander. A seasoned admiral and skilled tactician, Yamamoto hoped he would have the experience to execute such a complex operation. With the commander now selected, Yamamoto and his team could turn their attention towards tackling 2 significant problems that Operation Z would have to overcome. The first would be maintaining the element of surprise, as approaching Hawaii by traditional routes would expose the strike force to discovery by American patrols and end the operation before it even began. The second problem would be that the Japanese carriers did not have enough fuel capacity to make the journey in one trip, meaning that they would have to be refueled at some point along the route without being discovered. After much discussion, a plan was finally formed that looked to solve both of these problems. The Kido Butai was to head to an unexpected and unpatrolled part of the ocean, 800 miles north of Hawaii, which would be out of range of American reconnaissance. And with the Americans expecting that any attack on Pearl Harbor would likely come from the Marshall Islands to the west, an attack from this direction would take them by complete surprise. Being accompanied by specialized fuel ships, the carriers could also solve their second problem by refueling along the way, before continuing their journey to Pearl Harbor in complete radio silence to avoid detection. While taking out the American fleet at Pearl Harbor was essential, the true prize were the oil fields of the Dutch East Indies, with a simultaneous assault to take place against the Philippines that morning, alongside Malaya, Guam, Wake, Hong Kong, and Singapore, with the exact timing of these attacks to be essential if secrecy was to be maintained. It was to be a surprise attack of epic proportions. No longer would the Japanese have to succumb to the whims and demands of the European colonial powers. It would be an Asian continent controlled by Asians, with the Japanese seeing themselves not as conquerors, but rather as liberators of the Asian people. With the plan now set, the Kido Butai would be dispatched on November 26th, the very day that the Japanese received Hull's final note, which they perceived as little more than a complete declaration of war. The crew aboard the carriers, having been kept in the dark up until this point, would be informed for the first time that their target was to be Pearl Harbor, with a great cheer erupting amongst the young men, for whom many this would be the first real combat they would get to engage in. Moving in radio silence, the ships would turn off all lights to travel in complete blackout, with them also taking another serious precaution, changing the Japanese fleet code. This would completely neutralize the American codebreakers, who would now be unable to decipher their messages, leaving both their plan of attack and whereabouts to complete mystery. One thing was now for certain: wherever the Japanese decided to attack, the Americans would not see it coming. With the Kido Butai nearing their target, the Americans would begin to prepare for a Japanese attack somewhere in the Pacific, but where that was still anyone's guess. The British had noted a significant build-up of Japanese naval forces near the Malay Peninsula, with them relaying this information to Washington DC on December 6th. Upon hearing the news, during a meeting of the American naval leadership, Navy Secretary Frank Knox would ask, "Gentlemen, are they going to hit us?" "No, Mr. Secretary," Rear Admiral Turner would reply. "They are going to hit the British. They are not ready for us yet." It was a sentiment shared by much of the American military, who believed Japan to be either unwilling or incapable of making an attack against them. If the Japanese did dare to make an attack, most thought the Philippines was the most likely target, with there being almost no one who seriously believed that Pearl Harbor was in any sort of danger. This would be reflected in a message sent to General Walter C. Short, the American Army commander responsible for Pearl Harbor. The message warned him that the Japanese were likely to strike somewhere in the Pacific, but had no indication that Pearl Harbor itself would be a possible target, instead ordering him not to take any actions that were likely to cause panic amongst the civilian population. As a result, Short believed the most serious threat Pearl Harbor faced was sabotage from the 160,000 Hawaiian residents of Japanese ancestry. To mitigate this threat, the island's planes were clustered together on the runways so they could be more closely guarded, and military supplies, such as anti-aircraft rounds, were locked away to prevent sabotage. To reinforce the security of American outposts, he would send 2 of the 3 US Pacific-based aircraft carriers from Pearl Harbor to Wake and Midway Island, delivering support aircraft and reinforcements. The 3rd carrier, the Saratoga, was undergoing maintenance back on the west coast of the United States at the time. This would mean that the entire US carrier force, the key target of Yamamoto's operation, would now be absent at the time of the attack. The Japanese forces attacked Pearl Harbor on the morning of December 7, 1941. The attackers achieved complete surprise, with almost every American who looked up to the sky and saw the Japanese planes, assuming they were friendly aircraft engaged in training exercises. But then, the first bombs exploded. Torpedoes, specially designed for shallow waters surrounding the port, as well as armor-piercing bombs, which were dropped above the ships, piercing straight through their decks. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, leading the Japanese aerial forces, would message Nagumo, "Tora, Tora, Tora," translating to Tiger, 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 letting his commander know that he had achieved a strategic, operational, and tactical surprise. As more and more planes arrived overhead, one pilot would take this photograph of Battleship Row, showing the American fleet tightly grouped together, making them easy targets for the wave after wave of Japanese torpedo and dive bombers that were to come. Within minutes, the battleships Maryland and Tennessee were each hit, followed by the Arizona, which sank almost instantly. The first Japanese wave consisted of 183 planes, with torpedo bombers attacking the ships and dive bombers simultaneously attacking their airfields, preventing airborne resistance. But, much to their surprise, they found all the US aircraft clustered together, making them an easy target. Short's decision to pack them tightly together to prevent sabotage had proven to be a costly mistake, with the Japanese dive bombers wiping out almost all of their planes. The Americans were also unable to shoot back, as their anti-aircraft ammunition had been locked away to prevent sabotage. Desperate attempts were made to fight back, with men resorting to using their pistols to fire at the bombers as they passed by. After a brief interval, a second wave of 170 Japanese planes appeared, all of which were tasked with finishing off the battleships that were still afloat or only partially damaged. However, the Americans were alert this time and succeeded at shooting down 24 Japanese planes, with only 5 Japanese planes having been shot down in the first attack. 90 minutes later, the attack was over. the Japanese had sunk or damaged 19 ships and destroyed 188 planes while damaging 159 others. The attack killed 2,403 US servicemen, with nearly half of them on the US battleship Arizona. It appeared to be a total victory for Japan, who had only lost 29 aircraft during the assault. Admiral Nagumo was concerned sending a third wave would open his carriers up to attack, and so any further strikes were called off, believing sufficient damage had been done. However, although Japanese losses were minuscule, victory was not complete. The US carrier force, Yamamoto's key target, was not at Pearl Harbor, leaving the Americans with one of the most powerful parts of their navy still intact. The attack had also failed to hit American fuel depots and had not destroyed the US submarine base, leaving them with resources with which to rebuild their fleet. The next day, President Franklin Roosevelt declared war on the Japanese Empire, and 3 days later, Germany and Italy declared war on the United States. Pearl Harbor would rally the American people, who were once isolationist, into a furious nation intent on revenge, with Americans from all over the United States flocking to recruitment stations. Far from wiping out American influence in the Pacific, the Japanese had just awoken a sleeping giant. Yamamoto's biggest fear was about to come to fruition. A prolonged war with an industrial superpower was about to begin.